Hi, hello, welcome. This is Let's Talk About Myths, baby, and I am your host, Liv. And today I'm here with another conversation episode in our ongoing series on Euripides, every correct person's favorite playwright. And fortunately, if I was going to talk about Euripides for an entire month's worth of episodes, I was also going to speak with all of the Euripides-obsessed, maybe I'm projecting, but Euripides-obsessed scholars that I could find. And fortunately, a couple of them are returning guests, people that you have heard before, and I am very excited to say that today's episode is one of those. I spoke with Dr. Melissa Funke, who is just a joyfully lovely person. She and I have met a couple of times at different events, and it's just, oh my gosh, Melissa is so much fun. You might remember her from our episode last year on Phryne, the incredible hetairai from ancient Athens who basically made an entire epic career for herself, including like ridiculously long-lasting fame, like 2,500 years of long-lasting fame. And Melissa wrote a book about Phryne back then, and so came on the show. But today I actually have a conversation with Melissa that has been in the works forever. Like, I think probably since she and I met in person, which was like a good year and a half ago now, because at some point Melissa mentioned how she studies or did her dissertation or something. I'm sure she's going to say it in the episode, and I should have reminded myself before recording this intro, but here we are. Melissa extensively studied the Euripides fragments that survive. Now, I'm not talking about those new ones that were in the news recently, but we are working on a conversation regarding those as well. But no, these are the Euripides fragments that have been known for quite some time now. When it comes to Euripides, we have not only more plays than any of the other tragedians, but also more fragments. Lots of fragments, and some I knew about. There are some incredible fragments of more plays that he did featuring and starring these incredible female characters, but also, oh my god, there was so much. Melissa and I talked about so many of those fragments, what we do and don't know about those missing pieces and the stories that were attached to them. We had so much fun. It's so much more about Euripides, and these are the types of things that are really hard for me to cover as narrative episodes because they are so missing and piecemeal and fragmentary. And so to have Melissa come on and tell us all about them is just such a joy. Conversations, The Missing Women of Euripides, Fragments with Dr. Melissa Funke.
So why don't we just start from like kind of an overview of like the fragments, where they are, how they're preserved, how many there are, that kind of thing. Okay.
Yes.
And I will fully admit that I have a bunch of crib notes right here just to help myself remember all of these details. Okay. So Euripides, we have 18 plays, right? That we attribute to him. There's also the Rhesus. We're not going to talk about the Rhesus because it's very obviously not Euripidean. It's from the 4th century, and that's kind of the scholarly consensus at the moment. But those are the plays we have, right? So some of those survived because they are what we call the select plays. So those are the ones that were chosen in Alexandria and Byzantium, or not Byzantium, Constantinople, but by Byzantine scholars, just to be a little bit confusing, as the kind of canonical plays, right? So when we talk about canon formation, Euripides is the best example because his canon kind of condensed, it contracted, and then it expanded again because there was a discovery of a manuscript, right, of what we call the alphabetical plays, which are a remarkable collection of plays that has sort of opened up what we think of now in 2024 as the Euripidean canon. So we'll kind of start there. So Euripides is already one of those authors from the ancient world who has gone through that process of intentional selection but then felicity, right? Where you're like, boom, okay, now we have all these extra plays. How exciting is this? And what we deal with and what we think of as the canon now is affected by pure luck, right?
Yeah.
And so this is what I love about the ancient canon, is that a good chunk of it is selection. We always have to think about the process of selection when we think about these texts. But a good chunk of it is also, hey, we stumbled upon this, not stumbled upon it. We found it by luck, or we found it because we were doing an archaeological dig and someone pointed us to a place where we would find a bunch of papyri. But this combo, right, of, again, intention and felicity is what brings us his plays. So we have those plays, but we know the Suda, which is this Byzantine encyclopedia, tells us that he wrote about 90. Right.
Ugh.
And so all of our ancient playwrights, Aeschylus, Sophocles, they wrote tons of plays that we just don't have, or we just have titles, this and that. Now, for Euripides, though, the great thing is that we have over 1,000 fragments of his plays.
Is it that many? Oh,
yes, it's amazing. And we have the most of him, too.
Yeah.
Yeah, way more than Sophocles and Aeschylus. And I'm sorry, I know that you love Euripides the most. So I'm going to apologize to everyone listening who loves Aeschylus and Sophocles, but I also love Euripides the most.
This is Euripides' series. We don't need to apologize to those guys now.
Okay, we'll just give him his flowers. That's right. Or more appropriately, his crowns we should be giving him.
So many.
Yes, so we know he wrote like all of these plays, and we're missing a bunch of them. But because of this kind of further process of intention and felicity, we have all of these fragments. So a lot of them are preserved, but they're what we call book fragments. So they're preserved by people like Plutarch or Athenaeus, our wonderful source of fragments for everything. Mm-hmm. A fellow named Stabius, who in the 5th century CE was writing and compiling a list of advice for his son. Giant 5-volume, I think it's five or 6 volumes, right? It takes up 2 feet on a shelf almost, of quotations to give his son advice about sort of how to be a man.
Well, thank you to that guy. That must have helped us so much in terms of otherwise lost works.
Massively.
That's amazing.
Can you imagine though? I mean, it's the premise that they're for his son, but can you imagine your dad being like, here are 6 volumes of quotations about how you should live your life and metaphysics and the problems with marriage, right? Like it really is like a soup to nuts collection.
Wow.
Anyways, good old Stabius, good old John of Stobie collected all of these, and so we have a bunch of those book fragments. The problem with those is that they are completely out of context. He doesn't describe what's happening in the play. He doesn't talk about it.
Does he give the title? Of the play?
We do have the title in the manuscript of Stabius, nice. So that's helpful as well. But with like Plutarch and Athenaeus, they tend to talk a little bit more about the context within the play, so that's helpful as well. So we have all of those kind of, again, the quotations, and those come from sources like Plato. They come actually from Aristophanes, quotes a bunch of these plays. And then we have papyrus fragments. And those are the ones that come from that dig, the Grenfell and Hunt, the famous dig, where they found a bunch of Menander, a bunch of Sappho, and big chunks of Euripidean plays that we didn't have before. So again, it's pure luck, right? Yeah. What we get on that front. But then there's also the intentional quotation and selection of portions of plays that was happening in antiquity as well. Yeah.
I mean, I just love hearing about all of that. I feel like I don't think there's much for us to say at this point on it, but this feels like the right place to mention the new fragments.
Oh, yes.
Right? Like, I don't know how much you know, or I don't know how much there is beyond that article, which, of course, I have read obsessively. But it feels like the right time to, like, bring up that it still happens now, that we can still find new things.
Yeah, we're not done. We're not done with finding these things. And as long as we have papyri that are still coming to light, that are still being published and edited, we're going to keep finding fragments, which is really exciting.
Yeah.
For me, because I'm a scholar of fragmentary literature, like I'm always prepared for every argument I've ever made to be completely destroyed, right? By like one unlucky find, in my case, I guess it would be. But yeah, so there's 2, apparently up to 80 lines, I think altogether, fragments of Euripides. One is from a play Polyides, which is one of the much more obscure fragmentary plays. I think the one that's most exciting for, especially knowing your interest in women in Euripides, and also for me and my interest in women in Euripides, is from Ino. And Ino is an amazing, it's a story that Euripides returned to several times, to the character of Ino, and the story is connected to her. So she's both a mother and a stepmother. So her stories are complicated. She gets married to this fellow Athamas, and he's been married before. He has 2 children by Nephele, who is like a nymph, and they are Phrixus and Hele. So you might remember Phrixus and Hele from the story of the Golden Ram, right? So Ino tries to kind of get rid of them when she's the stepmother. Then she has her own kids. She goes off, basically goes missing, and Athamas thinks she's gone, and he remarries, and he has 2 more children. So sorry, Ino also has children. This, you can tell as I'm telling this story, there's so many threads to it.
Yeah.
Anyway, so he has children with Nephele, children with Ino, children with this third woman, right? So Ino comes back, and she plots against the children of the new woman in favor of her own children. And that's what this fragment seems to be part of that play.
Yeah.
And so Ino she's really amazing because she gets to be kind of a wicked stepmother. She gets to be the loving mother, right? But also the deadly mother, which is another Euripidean character that comes up again and again. So she's kind of like to me, she's almost like a Medea, right?
Yeah.
She's got that level of complexity of characterization, of sort of the compellingness of the way she acts and the choices she makes. So this new fragment, I'm really excited to find out what it really contains.
Yeah.
Apparently there's a conference happening at the University of Colorado in Boulder that will happen, I think, this fall, and they're going to introduce the content there. And so one of the main scholars of Euripidean fragments is at Colorado. His name is John Gibert. And I apologize if I'm not pronouncing his name correctly. But so I really look forward to seeing what that content is and how it might change our understanding of Ino as a character, and how she might have been characterized in that play by Euripides.
Well, I'm extra fascinated by that too, just because of the lack of Ino in other sources. You know, like we know who her parents are because she's a daughter of Cadmus and Harmonia, which is why I will remember her always. And we know, you know, that she had siblings and that her family had some issues.
Oh, those girls were trouble.
Yeah. You know, there's been some problems with the sisterhood there. But it's just so interesting because she is kind of the one who is otherwise missing from a lot of stories, right? She is not Agave, who tears her son's head off, and she is not Semele, who's the mother of Dionysus. She's kind of the other one. So I'd love to know more about what he wrote about her. Oh god. But I do have to say, the other fragment, for all that obviously I am most concerned with how Euripides handles women, the other fragment, which seems to suggest that a child died by drowning in a vat of honey, and his parents are trying to make him come back from the underworld. Is that kind of, did I get that right? I remember when I read it, I think. Because that sounds magnificently weird. So Euripideanly weird. So
this is the thing about the fragments, is that I don't think we give enough credit to Euripides for just how weird he is.
I mean, I try to, and I'm always, always surprised still.
He's just throwing stuff at the wall and seeing what sticks, I think, is how I would explain him as a playwright. No, I think that you'll often hear in conversations around tragedy in particular, oh, well, that can't happen in tragedy. And often that conversation is really shaped by the extant plays. So let's remember that we have 7, 7, 18, right? Like those are our tragedies that exist. And when we're shaping a conversation by that, with those limits, we are really misunderstanding, I think, how experimental and funny and odd tragedy could be, and how unsettling it could be. I mean, I think we can embrace the unsettling part, but when we look at some of those plays, so you're talking about Polyidus, which takes place on Crete, he's got a lot more plays that are connected to Crete, right? He has a play, it's called Cretans, where Pasiphae, right, the mother of the Minotaur, comes out and gives a speech. And you can imagine in a tragedy, this is like an aria, right? Like it's like a solo. And your actor is like, you know, doing their sort of their best job in performing this, in which Pasiphae defends herself for having slept with the bull and become impregnated by the bull. And she's blaming Minos, right? She's saying, listen, you're the one who messed up. You're the one who's being punished by the gods. And she goes through this really elaborate rhetorical defense. And the rhetoric she uses is the same kind of rhetoric you often see in speeches in courtrooms in Athens. So she says, for example, like, well, it's not like I fell in love with him because he was so good looking. I wasn't, you know, wasn't like he had these beautiful eyes and the color in his cheeks or whatever. But it's a really elaborate, fairly lengthy speech that we have preserved from that play.
I did not know about this.
Yeah, but that also kind of is leading into the weirdness. Yes, it is strange for a woman to fall in love with a bull and then sleep with it and then give birth to a half man, half bull. That's weird. And Euripides is basically saying that he's having Pasiphae say, this is not normal.
Yeah.
It's very strange. But also in a way that is, I would say, kind of empathetic or really like thoughtful in his characterization of Pasiphae too.
Unsurprising, because that's why he is so interesting. Because I mean, that's fascinating. I feel like I have so many names of women characters that he's written that get to do things like that, and just adding her, like, I didn't know that we had all of that. And I'm sure it's actually probably in the thing that you took the time to send to me once, and I haven't read it yet.
Don't even worry about that.
Well, now I'm like, at least I've got it, though, I realize, in a PDF somewhere. So I gotta go looking. Because that's, I mean, yeah. Well, that is more interesting than the honey, but the new fragment. So do we think that's from the same play? Or no, you said the Cretans is the one with...
Yeah, Cretans is a separate play.
Right.
But so we do, I think when we look at the patterns across the fragments, you can see Euripides returning to themes, returning to places, returning to mythological cycles.
Yeah. Where
he is, you know, he's going, I've got a bit more to explore here, or there's a new angle to take, and there's more for me to think of. So like I said, he does it with Ino, right? And her stories. He does it with Medea too. Yeah. Right. And I think that's where you and I have talked about before. Yeah. Because Medea is just probably the most compelling character that was put on stage in ancient Greece, at least according to yours truly.
Yeah. And me.
Yeah.
I will agree with you there.
Yeah.
No. Well, and he does it with Iphigenia too, in a really interesting way, right? Like,
yes.
Revisiting that story and kind of being like, I'm not done.
Yeah, and we're gonna actually get, again, weird. We're gonna really explore this really strange what if scenario with her. And so he does, it's not quite as many of the what ifs. Like, he's still working within, I think, fairly established mythological tradition. But with Medea, for example, he has her as the wicked stepmother in the play Aegeus. So, of course, Aegeus is the king of Athens, the father of Theseus. So Theseus has been sort of identified and claimed by Aegeus at this point. And she goes and she basically has Aegeus give him a poison cup. She's trying to kill Theseus. So Medea gets to be the evil stepmother too, right? And so you can kind of see this, like, her stepping into this really villainous space, right? That the play Medea is maybe not, she's not as villainous in that play. But you see her step into it in Aegeus.
Yeah. I also I have to say that you are one of my favorite people for saying that she's not as villainous in that play, because I agree with you. But when people talk about it, you know.
I mean, the outcome is villainous.
But you're right, though. She isn't. I just think a lot of the time people just come at what the outcome is versus the actual character in the play. Because I agree. Yeah, she is compelling, and you have empathy for her in the play. And so, yeah, having her turn. But of course, then on Theseus, which is my own, you know, dislike for the man. But I do love that we know that he wrote her doing that as well.
Yeah. There's also there's the play Pleiades, the daughters of Peleus, right? And that's Pelias, I should say, right? So this is the story. It's earlier, sort of in the adventures of Jason and Medea. You'll find it in the Argonautica, where she convinces the daughters of Peleus to tear him apart and boil the parts, right?
Yeah.
In the hopes, of course, that he'll regenerate like the ram she had just shown using magic. And of course, she gives them fake herbs, so they're not really magical, and they've actually just killed their father. So you see like these hints of Medea, the villain, hints of what Medea is capable of. And so to
Yeah.
me, in the context of those two plays, then you go back to the play Medea, you can really understand that characterization and the richness of what Euripides is doing in the play that exists when you think about the possibilities that these other two fragmentary plays present to us.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Now, when you mentioned that story of Medea and the daughters of Peleus, what comes to me obviously is Ovid, because I think his is probably the only version we have of that in detail that survives. My favorite thing about when Ovid tells that whole story is that there is a whole scene. I mean, granted, it's used really compellingly for his metamorphoses, so you never know what he was inventing. But there's this scene that's so heavily full of like explicit magic, and I am so obsessed with it when she's like flying around in her dragon chariot and she's picking up ingredients everywhere. And so it makes me wonder, if we have kind of this connection there, like how much of that did Ovid pull or was inspired by Euripides, and what we don't have. Like, do we know anything about the magic level?
So it's hard for us to be specific about those kind of details, right?
Yeah, fair.
But Ovid absolutely loves Euripides. I mean, he
Yeah.
loves tragedy, but he loves Euripides. And so when you
They're
look
both weird
at
dudes.
yeah, he's like he also loves the weirdness, and he loves to dig into these kind of more obscure stories, right? He wants to show all the sort of randomness. And so when you look at, like, for example, his poems, the Heroides, which are these series of letters written by the heroines of myth, right? And you actually have characters who appear in the fragmentary plays of Euripides and nowhere else. So it's very clear that he is inspired by the fragmentary plays of Euripides. Yeah. So I wish there was more magic for you.
Yeah.
I can't promise you that. There's probably some amazing messenger speeches.
I was hoping there was some fragment about, some kind of potion or something,
Yeah.
But you said the Heroides reference. That was perfect, because now I'm curious, what do we have, or if anything, I don't even know, of Hypsipyle? Because I know Euripides wrote a Hypsipyle.
Yes. Okay. So Hypsipyle is our most fulsome fragmentary play by Euripides, if that makes sense. So we have hundreds of lines from it, largely from a papyrus discovery. So we have a lovely long papyrus with tons and tons, like hundreds of lines of Hypsipyle. Hypsipyle is another one of those Euripidean plots where you're like, just how do I keep track of this plot? And so you can see, actually, when you look towards like new comedy and those really labyrinthine plots, you can see them kind of coming out of Euripides' plays too. So the story of Hypsipyle, I'm going to see if I can tell this. So just be patient as I go very slowly through it. So Hypsipyle lives on the island of Lemnos. Okay, and she's the daughter of the king Thoas. When Jason and the Argonauts get to the island of Lemnos, there are no men there because the women have killed them all. Now, Liv, you probably know this better. Have they killed them all because they had bad breath? They were struck with bad breath.
Yeah, there's like something where like they thought the women were struck with bad breath. Yeah, that's right. And so they killed the men.
That's right. So there's I think Aphrodite is involved in this, as she must give a curse. Okay. So that's like the background, right?
Yeah.
Jason and the Argonauts show up and all the women are like, well, hello, boys. So Hypsipyle has twins with Jason. But then Jason, of course, as heroes tend to do, takes off. And he takes the twin boys with him. So off they go. Okay. Hypsipyle, meanwhile, right, has to sneak off the island. And she has to get her father off the island too, if I'm remembering correctly. Anyway, so Hypsipyle ends up near Nemea, where she is enslaved, and she is the nurse to the young baby Opheltes. So who is the child of the king and queen there.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so while she's there, and this is where the action of the play Hypsipyle begins, and her sons have gone off and they're grown. So she is the nurse of this baby. There's some scenes in the play where she's like singing him songs, but she's sad because she can't sing the songs of her homeland, right? It's a really sort of insightful moment with an enslaved person who can't sing her own songs to this child, but she's sort of motherly to this child, right, as its nurse. Anyways, so of course, the 7 against Thebes and all of those armies come through Nemea at this point, too. So we've got like a whole bunch of sort of the multiverse of myth is all colliding here. That's right. And she takes the baby, Hypsipyle takes the baby, and Amphiaraus, who is a seer with the 7 against Thebes, and she takes him to a spring with the baby. While they're there, a snake bites the baby and kills it. So this is a side note, not to Euripides' play, but one of the stories that's told for the origins of the Nemean games is that they're the funeral games for this baby of Feltes.
Oh, okay.
So there's a little funny statue of a weird baby at Nemea, and that's the baby of Feltes.
Amazing.
It's just not a cute statue.
Well, I mean, they did not do a lot of cute babies.
They weren't good at it.
There's a lot of babies are tiny humans in really distortedly bizarre ways.
Yeah,
so.
Exactly.
They're always fun.
He looks like a little Oompa Loompa, in my opinion. Anyways, okay, so let's go back to Euripides' play. So the baby has been killed. She's being held responsible for this. In the meantime, there's a recognition of her sons and her. So there's a recognition that she is their mother, that she is not just your typical enslaved person. And this is what saves her from being put to death in the aftermath of the child being killed. So they're reunited. And this is a really common, the recognition plot. It's common in tragedy, but it's really, really, really common in Euripides' plays. Mm-hmm. And then that's what we see feeding into Menander's plays and new comedy. All of that recognition, it seems to me, is coming from Euripides' plays largely.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So it's this really complex play with this, very labyrinthine plot. But you have, because we've got these long passages on papyrus, we have lots of like the beautiful songs that she sings preserved. And so we have a lot better sense of Hypsipyle as a character. So one of the things that, when I was just going back through my dissertation on this topic, one of the things that really struck me is that in the plays of Euripides, one of the themes that he explores from a million different angles is what happens to women when they get pregnant in not ideal circumstances, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So,
well, we covered Ion very recently on the show, so I feel like that's a great example of that exact thing. Yeah.
Exactly. So there's all these plays where he goes to what's called the girl's tragedy, where a young woman gets sexually assaulted by a god or a hero, gets pregnant, gets in trouble from her father typically. But then I was looking back and I was thinking of these different stories like Hypsipyle, right? Where she's been impregnated by a hero, but she's not married to him. This isn't like an ideal scenario. Mm-hmm. There's also, what else is there? There is Skyrians, when Achilles is on the island of Skyros, and he is hidden amongst the girls. He's dressed as a girl and he impregnates the daughter of the king. And then what happens to her, and then Achilles. Exactly. There's also Alcmene, right? The mother of Heracles, who's impregnated by Zeus. So it's not just that it's all these sort of young girls, the Parthenoi being assaulted, right? It's all kinds of women. And it's what happens to women when they are put in a situation or are in a situation that is not the ideal sort of social pregnancy within marriage. And he comes back to this so many times and from so many different angles to think about what can happen to these women.
He just really was interested in women being real people. I will just never get over it. It's fascinating. I just feel like he, to me, is this, specifically after I read the Ion, because I hadn't read it before and I don't know how nobody told me what it was about before, but here we are. Because now that I've read that, I just Euripides is even better in my books, but so specifically because all of this stuff that I feel like I've based, the reason I started my show just being that we learn about all of these myths about women getting assaulted as if it's just this is a thing the gods do, everything's great. And I just feel like we had at least Euripides is proof that there were people back then being hey guys, this is kind of dark, we can examine it. and it's so like reassuring to know that somebody looked at the stories and thought, it's not great. Like, why don't I kind of tell these stories and sort of, get pull apart that idea that this is just like a fine thing because the gods are there.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think in all of those plays, Ion is the extant example of this, right? And I call in my work, I've called them the rape and recognition plots, because what happens is, again, someone's sexually assaulted, they give birth, and then there has to be a recognition at some point that saves the mother of these children. And then the children go on to become heroes. So usually you have the deus ex machina, you have the god that comes in at the end of the play and says, actually, don't worry, like, you don't need to kill your daughter, or you don't need to do this, because these are the children of Poseidon or someone. I want to make a point that it is not typically the god who impregnated the young woman who does he doesn't show up and clean up the mess at the end, right?
Never. That's crazy.
Typically it's like Hermes or someone else who comes in and does that. One play, fragmentary play that I think you'll be very interested in, and it's one of my favorites, is Auge. And it follows that pattern. So Auge is a priestess of Athena, and the one who impregnates her is Heracles when he assaults her. He assaults her in a sanctuary of Athena. And so, of course, Athena's mad about that. And so Auge is sort of fleeing, right? She's going to get in trouble for doing this. But the interesting thing is that within the context of this play, it seems, and we only have a couple short fragments from this portion of it, that Heracles comes back. And he says to her, actually, I was drunk when it happened. I admit I did you wrong.
Wow.
So he says, homologeo sadikena, that I did you, I admit I did you wrong.
Yeah.
And it's kind of remarkable to have that coming out of the mouth of the man.
Yes.
Who is the one who assaulted her.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's not an apology. I want to be really clear, because there's not
no.
People don't say sorry in ancient Greece in the way that we did. You give an apologia, which is like, the reasoning behind your action.
Yeah.
But still, that adikain, that word that means like to do wrong, to do an injustice, is really remarkable that he acknowledges it.
Well, it's the acknowledgement, right? That's what makes the big difference. It doesn't, I feel like if it was an apology, it would be less realistic. Like, I like that it's just this acknowledgement. It reminds me of like just when I did pick up the Ion, and like right there at the beginning, Hermes is like, Apollo raped, of course I'm going to forget the poor Creusa. Yeah. Like it's so explicit. It's so like direct, and I just feels like so interesting the ways he was really open about criticizing the way the gods or heroes like Heracles behave, and not even like necessarily criticizing it. It's just, I guess, again, like I'll say the same thing over and over again, but it's just that he was interested in what the women would experience from a realistic, as much as he could do, perspective. And I think that is just so unique.
Yeah. Well, if you look at Ion too, Creusa, when she's talking about it, she says, I called out for my mom. Like she talks about the actual experience of being raped.
Yes.
And she talks about the sort of distress that she felt. And that's the thing that, to me, like when you look at the law around sexual assault in the ancient world, especially in Athens, right, where these plays, in classical Athens, where these plays are being produced, the concern, especially for a young woman who's been sexually assaulted, is that she's no longer eligible for marriage. And then you've really affected the household that she comes from, because then she's not able to be used in the way, right, that young women are used to join households through marriage, et cetera, et cetera. And that's really the concern. So it's not that they didn't understand that there wasn't like pain and trauma for the young woman, but that just wasn't encoded in their legislation. But Euripides, when he has characters talk like this, he's acknowledging, yes, there's also the pain and trauma. I think Ovid's really good at that too. And I think Ovid gets that probably from Euripides.
Yeah.
Menander in a couple of his plays mentions similar things. And I think, again, that's coming through Euripides. And in fact, Auge, that play that I just mentioned, one of our fragments is actually quoted in a play by Menander called the Epitripontes, which features a similar story of the young woman getting assaulted, getting pregnant, having, troubles because of this. So you can see that Menander's like, yes, I'm pointing to the plays from Euripides that I am taking these ideas from.
Yeah.
But yes, absolutely. This is one of the things I always think about Euripides. Now, I have a question for you on this note, because I've been asked this before, and well, I know how I answer it now, but my answer changes. Can we call Euripides a feminist because he does these things?
I think so. I mean, like, obviously there's so much you can say around using the term feminist, whether we want to say proto-feminist or whatever. But like, I think yes, because to me, well, it's interesting because Michaela and I have been talking about this a lot when it comes to this series, because there's so much like hilarious Euripidean slander out there, primarily from Aristophanes and people who believed Aristophanes. And this idea that like that he hated women, right? This idea that he was like bad to women, and then the examples being women like this who are just like complex and interesting and like realistic human beings. And so to me, because especially I think because he got criticized for it in that way, and because he chose to write these women who are not just problematic for the sake of being problematic, but problematic in an like distinctly human way. Like to me, in his work, the women really are, I mean, equal in a very specific way, but equal to the men in terms of their stories, their realism, the way he treats them, like just the ways he's interested. Like to me, there is an equality there that I don't think I've found elsewhere.
Yeah, I mean, I often think about, say, Aeschylus or Sophocles too, and how I love tragedy, full stop, right?
Yeah.
And I think, a character like Clytemnestra is also really compelling, but I don't think she is as sympathetic as Medea even, right?
No,
and
exactly.
That's something that I think about. The way I think about this now is because often when I'm watching a movie or watching TV shows, I'm like, I can tell sometimes, I'm like, I don't think the creators of this particularly like women.
Yeah.
Right. So the example I'm going to give, sorry to some of the fandom, is Game of Thrones.
Oh,
because people are like, look at all the strong female characters in it.
Yeah.
And like, you can have a strong female character. It doesn't mean you like women.
No.
And it doesn't mean you're not getting a weird kind of pleasure out of having them suffer or whatever. I don't think Euripides ever gets pleasure from the scenarios in which his female characters find themselves. Right. Yeah. And that's a really important thing for me in terms of just my own enjoyment of these texts.
Yeah. No, I agree entirely. And to your point about Clytemnestra, because yes, like Aeschylus and Sophocles, like they both also write really interesting women, really compelling women, like absolutely enjoy their female characters as well. The difference to me is likability almost. Like Euripides was less concerned with making them likable or making them kind of fit into the box, the women's box. Like I think that the others wrote realistic women, but I think they wrote realistic women to men, like what men think realistic women are.
Yeah, like Clytemnestra is the horror that men imagine women to be doing, behind closed doors. What do women really think of me? They would all murder me in the bathtub with an axe, right?
Yeah.
But Euripides, his women have a bit more space, a bit more. Again, there's just a lot more nuance in them.
Yeah.
Going back to kind of the young women who've been assaulted theme here. There's a play that it's the one play. If I could have one play back whole again, it's this one. It's called Melanippe Wise, Melanippe Sophe. And it's the story of this young woman. Again, she's been assaulted by Poseidon, gets pregnant, exposes her twins in a cattle barn, right? And then what happens is, of course, like the shepherd finds them, comes to the king and says, we found these babies. And she defends the babies and the woman who gave birth to them as though they're not her own babies to her father. So this speech was famous in antiquity. Melanippe is mentioned in Aristophanes, so right within Euripides' own generation, is also mentioned. I want to say in Aristotle as an example of a bad woman. Or a less than ideal woman. I believe it's in Poetics too, where her name pops up. But imagine Melanippe as this sort of young, unmarried woman, a Parthenos, who has just given birth to twins, and she's defending them. She's doing this like really rhetorical exercise of talking about a scenario that she is actually part of, but other people don't recognize that. And she's saying, like, is it the fault of this young woman if someone comes along and assaults her? Well, obviously not. And we shouldn't blame these young women. It's this really remarkable, again, it's this really remarkable speech to put in the mouth of this young woman, right? And again, when we think about the context of Athenian tragedy being performed, written by men, performed by men for an audience that's largely male, imagine having those words come out of that performer's mouth to that crowd.
Yeah.
That's a really remarkable thing. It shows to me that at least Euripides is really aware of the tension that underlies the way women are treated in classical Athens. And that he is leaning hard into that tension and trying to digest it, trying to navigate it, trying to think about it in ways that perhaps his peers were not yet.
Yeah. Well, and I was just going to say the Ion is so similar in that way. Like you imagine the people watching those scenes and the very explicit ways in which Apollo is blamed for like a physical trauma is just so interesting to me. But yeah, that's how I see him. It's just like he was interested in them. Yeah. And that's kind of what makes him different in my head to Aeschylus and Sophocles. I think I said yesterday about this, like that Aeschylus and Sophocles to me write Penelopes. And I guess I mean that now in the case of like not the Clytemnestras. Those are sort of what I mean. I guess they write either Clytemnestras or Penelopes. If I just want to use those two, right? Like even just the comparison in the Odyssey, like even, in Agamemnon's deadly or, underworld comparison, like they write those two. That they're sort of the only versions of women. They're either perfect or they're horrible. And they can they're still interesting. But to me, it's like Euripides is looking at all of the layers of humanity in women versus sort of more of a kind of masculine caricature or like a man's caricature. Rather.
Yeah. And I actually think that's kind of interesting to think about too, because, whenever you are in the ancient world, because they are so binary about how they think about gender, at least how they've idealized gender, not necessarily how it's actually practiced on the ground, but they think about it in this really binary way. And so whenever you kind of are talking about women in the ancient world, you're talking about men at the same time, right? They're like two sides of a coin. So I often think of that too. One of the things that I really appreciated, again, from the fragmentary plays, is what Euripides is doing to think about masculinity and how it operates too. So this is actually I'm going to kind of segue into the play Antiope.
Oh, please.
Which is a story about a woman who has been impregnated by Zeus in the form of a satyr. And again, her sons are grown, right? And there has to be a recognition so that they can save her from basically, another kind of evil stepmother character. But this is a play in which the two sons have a debate between themselves about what it means to be a man. Right?
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so this appears in Plato's Gorgias. So like he's interested in this too a little bit, because of course in that dialogue, they're thinking about rhetoric and the role of rhetoric in the polis. So in this play, you have the young man, Zephus, he's like the kind of masculine, let's get into action, let's go build stuff, let's be in the polis, let's do this. And then his brother Amphion, who is like a musician, right, who plays the lyre. And the two of them have a debate about how to be a man. And the interesting part is that Amphion, like the musician, is like, you don't always have to be in action. You don't have to go to war. You don't have to be building things. You can use your brain. You can use your mind. And this is a really interesting kind of idea. Again, if you think about the context of classical Athens, right?
Yeah.
You're using your rhetorical prowess. You're using your mind in the court system, in the assembly. So there's these kind of competing visions of masculinity. But the great thing about Euripides is that no one ever wins his agons, his debates, right?
Yeah.
Is that he always kind of creates space for the gray to come in. And in this play, you have this really wonderful, again, these competing images, but that ultimately are kind of found not to be in competition with one another, these different ways to be a man, which I find that's very fascinating. The other thing though, that those fragments from that play kind of hint at is that the brothers, before they've kind of officially kind of reconciled with their mother, they accuse her of maybe not having been assaulted, of using the assault by Zeus as an excuse for, just she got pregnant by a man and that was it. Right. And so you also see again, like some of the complexities of that vulnerability of the woman in that situation that Euripides is trying to work through too. So again, he's always working through complexities. He never just gives you a solution.
Yeah. Well, no, that's not interesting.
No, not at all.
Yeah. I imagine, well, I hope, and I actually don't even know the answer to this because I don't even know if there is Fragments. Phaedra, the lost Phaedra.
Yes.
What do we know? What do we don't know?
Okay. So we have Hippolytus, right?
Yeah.
And so the Hippolytus that we have is actually called Hippolytus Garland Bearer, right? So that's the second version of this play. He wrote an earlier version called Hippolytus Veiled, because Hippolytus is veiling. He's shamed by what's happened, right? He's being modest. And so in that play, the characters of Hippolytus and Phaedra are both, I think, more extreme. At least that's what the fragments insinuate. So Hippolytus is even more sort of incel-y. I don't know how to say it. He's not. No, incel isn't the right way to describe actually Hippolytus. Let me rephrase that. Hippolytus is even more sort of shunning of women completely. Right.
Yeah.
He's very extreme in the way that he's shunning women, even in the extant play, but even more so in the earlier version. And Phaedra is the one who comes directly onto him in that version, as far as we can tell. So in the extant version, of course, it's the nurse who kind of goes, that's it. I'm going to go tell him that you're in love with him, and I'm going to push this along, right? Which then results in the incorrect accusation of rape. Now, in the original version, the first version, at least, it seems to be Phaedra who directly comes on to him, and he rejects her. And then what seems to happen again in that first version is that she actually creates a scene and tries to create evidence that she's been assaulted. Like she scratches herself, right? To make it seem that he really had assaulted her. So she, she's much more active in that one, much less torn by her actions, it seems, and also much more deceptive. Yeah. So, when characters like in Aristophanes complain about, Phaedra as one of the reasons why they don't think Euripides likes women, I think that's the Phaedra that they're talking about.
Yeah. That's very interesting. And I feel like I've heard things about this, but I don't know how much it's speculation or not. But do we know why he wrote another one? Like, there was like a backlash to the original?
The reception the reception to Phaedra in particular was not positive. It was too much. Okay, it's funny to me, and this is, I think, one of the kind of pieces of evidence I'd like to have more of is more audience response.
Oh
right?
My God!
So it's funny to me when you hear things like, "Oh, well, we didn't preserve this play." Right? This play didn't make it into the canon because its topic was too shocking. Well, what the heck is Medea doing in there? Right?
Yeah.
Like, what are the lines that people are drawing when they're forming the canon? And yes, those lines are often very random and or they seem to be irrational or illogical to us. But so I'm interested in what was so negative about that Phaedra, right? That they didn't want anything to do with. That he sort of felt compelled to rewrite it in a more nuanced fashion or in a way that was more sympathetic to Phaedra, right? Where she's sort of lovesick and she's driven to this. And then the nurse is the tipping point in that second version. Why would he be compelled to change it in that way?
Yeah.
The other thing we know from the fragmentary plays is that plot type. It's called Potiphar's wife. And that's when a married woman falls for a younger woman and then there's a false accusation, or younger man. Pardon me, I just made it much more interesting.
It would be.
So a married woman falls for a much younger man and then there's a false accusation of rape when he rejects her. So he came back to that storyline a few times in the play Phoenix, but really importantly in the play Stheneboia, which is the story of Bellerophon. Right. Who he comes to, he's been in Corinth and I can't remember where he goes, but he goes to be absolved of murder, basically. And Stheneboia falls in love with him. And again, from the fragments of this play, it seems like she's doing everything she can to seduce him. One of the fragments is about how Eros teaches you, right? Desire teaches you to be deceptive. It's the best, most effective teacher of all of these tricks and wiles. So clearly she's trying to seduce him. He rejects her. She accuses him. He gets banished, right? And this is why he has to go kill the chimera. He's sent off. Anyways, so within the context of this play, one of the things he does is he comes back and says, I'm going to take you. We're going to fly away together on Pegasus. And of course, he takes her up on Pegasus and drops her off the horse as revenge. And that seems to happen within the context of this play, right? You can imagine that messenger speech.
I was just going to.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah.
See, and because things like that are lost, those are the reasons why poor Bellerophon is never the one riding Pegasus in any modern adaptation of anything.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Because he rides Pegasus.
He's the only one. God damn it.
But in a play by Euripides.
Yeah.
He rides, Bellerophon rides Pegasus, right?
Yeah.
On the machina, on the crane.
Okay, that was going to be my question. Oh my God.
So this is what Aristophanes is making fun of when he has people riding around on dung beetles to get up to Olympus, right?
Aristophanes he did not get the brilliance. Sorry. Like he just
do you think so?
He just seems like he was such a dick about it.
You know, I think it was really noted in antiquity already by the 4th century by playwrights that Aristophanes and Euripides were like so entangled in their playwriting. There's a verb that a playwright named Cratinus, it's like to Euripid Aristophanize, basically, is the verb that he makes up. But like it's that the way that those two playwrights are entangled, so that, you know, Aristophanes becomes one of our major sources for fragments of Euripides. And he's parodying him so much. You know, like that's before he adds Zeusai. There's the multi plays of Euripides that get parodied as they're trying to escape. They keep trying to do these scenarios from Euripides' escape plays. So Andromeda, we would not have Andromeda basically if it wasn't for Aristophanes.
Right. Yeah. All right.
Yeah.
I mean, I understand his value in I just feel like I don't know that he respected Euripides based on the way he makes fun of it. Like, I'm glad we have it because we have all these fragments and I think we have all these insights. But to me, like, and maybe it's also just the way that people have interpreted Aristophanes, because I know I've come across the argument in many places that Euripides hates women, all because somebody like believed like a joke in Aristophanes. So I'm kind of like, you know, whether or not he believed it, he's definitely contributed to the idea that Euripides hated women, which I take offense to, I guess.
Yeah. I think he's making fun of that reputation. I think he's making fun of people who are kind of taking that simplistic interpretation. Part of it though, like that idea that, you know, does Aristophanes respect Euripides? I think he does. Yeah. Because he keeps coming back to him. He might not have said that in conversation.
Right, yeah.
But you know, when someone's kind of obsessed with someone in a negative way, you're like, again, there's like a pleasure, it's not, you actually don't hate that person. There's some like enemies to lovers vibe between those two, I think. Yeah.
I could see all of that.
Yeah.
I like that world.
I'm writing fanfic apparently today here.
I mean,
your listeners can just, you know, run with it, please.
Yeah. I mean, we love to theorize on Euripides because we have to a lot because there's not a ton.
Yeah, exactly.
So, like, is it that you studied specifically like the women in the fragmentary plays?
Yes, that's what I wrote my dissertation on was gender. But of course, the women are so important to tragedy as a whole, right? Like even in the ancient world, people are like, wait a second, most of these choruses are made of women. Most of these characters, or a lot of these characters, are women. So even in the ancient world, people are acknowledging this. We were talking about how people think that Euripides was, you know, some kind of a misogynist, even in the ancient world. So when you have things like the sort of letters of Aristophanes, the life of Aristophanes, and these are from later antiquity, and they are pretty much fictionalized accounts of his life. Mm-hmm. One of the ways that he's said to have been killed is by a bunch of women tearing him apart. Right. And of course that just goes back to Bacchae, right? Yeah. You know, they're taking these ideas straight out of his own work. But because women were so angry at him, you know, because of how he was depicting them, so that they tore him to death, basically. But like already in the ancient world, people are going, there's something about Euripides and women.
Yeah. And I think, to me, I'm so interested in it, but I think that where that comes in, it feels like it's that really quintessential thing where the men are just threatened by Euripides' interest or like concern with women.
Yes.
Like it just feels like they're like, he could be dangerous, you know?
Well, and I mean, there has to be an element, and I'm completely speculating, but I'm just imagining if I am like a nice, secure, elite Athenian male in, 415 or whatever, and these women are showing up on stage and they're expressing these concerns, or we're taking an empathetic approach to their experiences, I'm going to listen to that and go, okay, that destabilizes my identity. It destabilizes my place in society. And I'm a little threatened by it, right? That I'm not sure what to do with it. And if you think about it, Euripides, of the three major Athenian playwrights, was not winning tons of awards in his own lifetime. He did win a few, but not compared to the other two, right? His success comes after his death. That's really when he becomes a big deal. And it's because he's no longer, I think, quite as threatening anymore. Yeah.
No, that's the thing. I just think it's so interesting to just imagine that issue around all of it. Because, I mean, and especially I thought of it when ages ago now that I was covering the Helen. Because like that too, it's such a threat. This idea that he's rewriting a woman like Helen, this woman that is famous for being hated. And he's like, oh, hey, I've written this Helen where she didn't do anything for you to hate her for. Like, what do you think of that?
And there's a happy ending.
Yeah. And
like
Menelaus looks like a loser.
Yeah.
Well, he loved a happy ending.
He did. I mean, Andromeda, right? It has a happy
like an eye
ending.
among the Taurians.
Yeah.
No, Ion, technically. Yeah.
I would put the asterisk on Ion. So, and that's kind of how I feel about these plays where like the god comes in at the end, the Deus Ex Machina comes in and says, don't worry, the children, that your life was threatened by, they're going to become heroes. You'll be okay, right? You'll be the mother of heroes. And it's always to me like a kind of like a feeling for the woman.
Yeah,
because
that's true.
It hasn't really rectified what's happened to her. It's kind of like Heracles coming and saying, "Oh, I did this. I acknowledge I did a bad thing."
Yeah,
and it ends there.
Yeah. I do not say sorry for it, but
exactly. Exactly.
So, are there any others that you haven't gotten to in terms of fragmentary women? Because I want to know all of them.
I've got to look at okay, sorry, another one of my faves is the play Alexander, which is of course the story of Paris, right, of Troy. Of course. And it seems to have been in a trilogy of plays about the Trojan War, right, of different stages throughout the Trojan War, which I find really fascinating. So it's the same trilogy as Trojan Women.
Can I make a prediction?
Go ahead.
Did Euripides write a Oenone? And is that where Ovid might have gotten something from the Heroides?
Okay, so Oenone does not pop up in this play.
Okay.
So I haven't seen any evidence of that, but that's a really good point, right? Because Ovid knew this stuff, right?
Yeah, I was waiting for you to say
If I could just talk to Ovid and ask him questions about Euripides.
And also maybe what was going on with the Ars Amatoria? Like where do you actually stand? But yeah.
Okay, that's awesome. I love the Ovid sidebars here. Because to me, Ovid and Euripides are, again, they're so melded
for the Ars
literary
Amatoria.
Yeah. Although I feel like that might have been a parody, possibly.
I know exactly. That's one thing. That's why I want to ask him because I'm like, dude, I think there's everything else you seem really interesting. So yeah.
Okay, so let's go back to Alexander.
Paris,
Okay, so it's the story of Paris. Yeah. So the kind of the information that happens before the play starts is, of course, that Hecuba was pregnant with Paris and had a dream that she gave birth to a firebrand that was going to burn down the city. So they exposed the child, right? And of course, like I don't know anyone in ancient myth who's exposing children. I'm like, the track record of exposed children coming back and causing a problem is 100%.
Truly,
batting 1,000 for destruction. So.
Yep.
Just
good luck.
Don't do it. It's not a great idea. So what happens is they're doing a games, right, in Troy, and Paris is an adult now, right, and he's just a shepherd supposedly, but he comes back and he's doing very well at these games, and the other sons of Priam and Hecuba are getting pretty ticked off and jealous about this. Now, the fragments suggest that they're coming to Hecuba and saying, kill him. He's making my life hard. And she is biting. She's going for this. So when we think of Hecuba from Hecuba and Trojan Women, we think of her as this vengeful mother, right? And this mother whose love for her children is so so huge that it drives her to these great acts of vengeance. But the amazing thing that we see in this is the hints of that Hecuba to come, right? It's like the Hecuba prequel, basically. But that Hecuba already has this within her. She's not just this like bereaved saintly, well, she's never a saint, but this bereaved mother, right? That she can be violent and vengeful for her children. That's just already in the roots of her character. And that's one of the things I really love about this play. And again, the thing I love about the Fragments is seeing these iconic women like Medea, like Hecuba, and seeing sort of the roots of how Euripides is thinking about them and thinking of how they get to the point at which they are these like very famous, iconic characters. And again, just thinking through different potential scenarios for them. So yes, that I think is probably one of my other faves. Amongst the fragmentary plays. But again, it's because we think of Hecuba in a certain way, and we have other ways to think of her that were presented right in the ancient world, that were probably part of the way that people thought of someone like Hecuba, but that we have lost because they didn't make it into the canon.
I mean, he's just so interesting. And so, beyond women, you were looking at gender. Was there anything else kind of at play in these fragments, or just anything beyond women as well?
Oh, yeah. Okay. So there's some interesting men, as I mentioned earlier, although this kind of ties back to women. There's Achilles in Skyrians when he's on the island of Skyros and he's dressed like a young woman, right? And that play unfolds where he can never really, he can never get rid of his heroic identity. Right. So even though he's dressed as a woman and no one seems to have noticed that he's among the girls, he manages to impregnate one. Right. And of course this play seems to be when Odysseus also shows up and has to take him off to war. There's no potential for Achilles not to be this hero. So there's obviously through that, there's an examination of masculinity. Right. And who gets to sort of shift between gender identities and who can't, and someone like Achilles just really can't. That's written in stone for him. One of the more fascinating plays to me, where you have men and you have sexuality coming into play, is the play Chrysippus. Yes.
I know that name.
Oh, okay. What do you know about Chrysippus?
I think I have an idea of what's to come. I didn't know that Euripides wrote a play.
Yes. So Chrysippus is the son of Pelops, right? Pelops and Hippodamia, House of Atreus, all that. So he is the illegitimate son of Pelops. Laius. So everyone knows Laius is the father of Oedipus, speaking of people who expose babies unsuccessful. Anyways, so Laius, and this is before all the events of Oedipus unfold, but Laius comes and there's different versions of the story, and the fragments we have of this play don't really seem to indicate which is which. But he's either taking Chrysippus off to participate in a games, but he's around Chrysippus. So he's a young man, but he's older than Chrysippus.
Yeah.
And he sexually assaults Chrysippus. So that's interesting because we have very few mentions of same-sex desire in tragedy, right? We have Myrmidons by Aeschylus, which is, again, Achilles and Patroclus. And it's very fragmentary. There's a mention of a thigh, right? Like, it's very fragmentary. But same-sex desire does not find its way onto the tragic stage as much as one might expect, given how much same-sex desire is talked about in the context of classical Athens, right? This, to me, is one of the mysteries of tragedy, is why it doesn't get as much airtime. And so in some senses, I find tragedy to be a little, even though you're having all these women doing all kinds of wild things, in some senses it's kind of conservative, right? When it comes to desire and sexuality. Desire is so often in tragedy a scary, destructive thing, right? Very, very rarely is it anything that brings you anything good, right? It's like the thing that makes Phaedra act in the way she does. Anyways, so in this play, right, you see, first of all, same-sex desire, but it's also, again, really destructive and has, so it seems to lead to the curse. So apparently Pelops puts a curse on Laius and his house.
Yeah.
That I think is what leads to the whole Oedipus situation, I think, in some versions of that myth. But one of the interesting, what we call a testimonium, so little comments about the content of the play, but not the quotations from the play itself, says that this, in Euripides' play, this is his way of offering an origin for same-sex desire between men too.
Huh.
Now, whether that's the case, like
Yeah.
whether that's, perhaps in some, the final speech of the play or something. But to me, that's a really interesting potential there, that also same-sex desire there is starting in assault too. So again, it's one of those little nuggets of sexuality that are so rare in tragedy, but also there's something about masculinity and what it means to be a man, right? Folded into that. And as we know, pederasty is so folded into identity in classical Athens, at least among a certain elite group. So we see Euripides kind of taking those challenging topics on, and trying to at least begin to explore this one.
Do we get the sense of whether it was meant to kind of mirror a pederastic relationship in terms of the ages?
Well, we certainly know that within the context of this play, Laius is the older one.
He's older,
and Chrysippus is the sort of the youth, right? So that, I think that is absolutely meant to, in some sense, reflect pederasty.
I'm only thinking of just whether, because I'm going to forget who I spoke to about this, but it was kind of brought up that in most of the stories, particularly with gods, so different, but, when there are same-sex relationships where neither is kind of like the obviously, older one, it kind of tends to end in tragedy. Apollo's relationships, things like that. So I was just kind of interested in that, since this is definitely not, not meant to be a romantic story.
Well, and that's the thing, like, at least with, say, the stories of Apollo that we find, like he seems to be sort of in love, or at least desiring. And again, we don't have enough of this play left to know kind of what causes that act. But at least to me, the comment that's Euripides offering an etiology for same-sex desire, like, suggests that there's an element of desire, at least from Laius to Chrysippus, right? Chrysippus is the victim of assault, but so there's something there. Something. Again, this is the thing about working with fragments. You're like, there's something there. I can't figure out what it is, but I can speculate what it might have been.
And as soon as you said the name, I just remembered basically having read that anecdote, just simply that there is, a version of the story where Laius assaulted him and it spawned the origin of the curse, or the Sphinx itself. And I just kind of was immediately like, where did I read that then? Because I would have remembered if it was Euripides.
Maybe in Aeolian.
That's the thing. I was on Theoi. I pulled that up just while you were talking, because I think it might have been, Pseudo-Polydorus says it really, really briefly. Okay. So there's at least that. Oh yeah, there is Aeolian. Here too.
So that's one of the things is when we're trying to, like, put the plots of these plays back together, or at least trying to speculate on what they looked like. So for some of them, we have a whole papyrus collection that's known as the Tales of Euripides, and they're hypotheses. So clearly in the ancient world, people, as they were collecting, and especially like through the Hellenistic period, then we get into the imperial period, where people just wanted to, like, know all of these plays, but maybe didn't want to read them all. Right. You might have a collection of little synopses of each play. Right. Or you would have the mythographers, people like Apollodorus, people like Hyginus, who are writing down just the stories. So we go back to Apollodorus and to Hyginus all the time to put back these stories together. Hyginus will say the odd time, this is from Euripides, which is helpful, but sometimes he says it and you're like, actually, this doesn't seem to be from Euripides.
I've always found that work to be less helpful than even Pseudo-Polydorus.
Well, it's such a weird work, right? Like, it could just be like schoolwork. Right. It's such a strange little collection.
Well, I mean, that's the most fun, is just wondering where these things also, like, where did they actually fit in the ancient world when it's like all we have? And I think I often wonder how much, weight we give to something that's compared to the weight it was given back then.
That's exactly right. And so that's the thing for me that the more I've been working on Fragments, the more I appreciate the intellectual process that got us what we have. Right. And then the more it makes me question how that process unfolded. And again, that combination of intention and felicity that comes together, where you're like, maybe we do have like a schoolboy's collection of synopses of myth. Right. And maybe he made a bunch of mistakes, and maybe my argument is resting on one of those errors, right?
Yes.
So, I mean, that's the one thing. If you ever read my work on fragments, there's a lot of, well, this seems to be the case. It's likely the case. I really hedge my bets because I don't want to get too far out on a pretty fragile limb.
Yeah.
But the thing about fragments that I think is salutary, that's really important for all of us who work on the ancient world and think about the ancient world to always consider, is that there's always a process, even if you have full works, right?
Yeah.
They come to you through a process. They didn't like, you know, it's not like someone was just like, here's the original copy of Oedipus by Sophocles, and they handed it to someone who handed it to someone who handed it to someone. It was rewritten, right? You know, bits of corruption come in with the rewriting. It was chosen to be preserved intentionally for a lot of different reasons that we don't fully understand still. You know, there's a process for everything we have from the ancient world. It's just that with fragments, it's so obvious to us, you know, that it's laid bare. But I think it's really important for all of us to kind of to think about the ancient world itself as fragmentary, and what we have as a fragment. Yeah.
If I have become anything on this show, it is emphasizing that to the point of annoyance. It was very poorly phrased, but I just like I love when I have guests say it, because it's like it reminds listeners that I'm not repeating myself unnecessarily. It's
okay, well, I would just
really
like to say,
important.
yes, Liv knows stuff, and you should always believe her.
Thank you.
She knows what she's talking about. Not that you needed me to say that, but
I mean, but especially with that, because I swear I say it all the time. I did a Q&A series recently, and so often my answer is like, okay, well, like I was saying, and then I just go on and on about fragments and what survives and what doesn't, and why that could be and what we don't know, and because it's just so interesting. Like,
it really
I am
is
obsessed with that. And then the finding of new fragments and being like, oh, here's some more, like, and that could be happening all the time, especially with, you know, whatever they're doing in Pompeii. I haven't been fully following, but I mean,
and the fragments of Euripides, and even like the bits where we don't consider them necessarily fragments because they're parts of a whole play that we have preserved elsewhere, right?
Right.
But some of those are some of the most exciting bits and pieces that we have from antiquity, right? So there's the fragment of Orestes, the chorus with the musical annotations that people have reconstructed. So, you know, these little bits and pieces often have they're the richest sources of information on aspects of performance or aspects of the reception of a play that we just wouldn't understand if we were just looking at the play. Yeah. Right? If you just look at that script all by itself, you're missing out on so much.
We recorded a whole episode on music, ancient tragedy yesterday with Sean Gerd. So,
excellent! Oh, that's gonna be so good. Okay, I look forward to hearing that one. I'm gonna have to use that for my classes because I love talking about music and I love playing the reconstructed Orestes chorus for my students because it just the sound of the aulos and the sound of the singers blows their mind. It's so different to what they've expected.
I have a couple different pieces of audio to slot into that episode that I haven't listened to yet, but Sean was like playing some notes on the guitar and explaining it to us, and it was just like the most interesting thing ever. So that
is so cool. That is so cool. Okay, I do have to. There's one fragment I do have to talk about because it brings together music and fragments, and like creativity, right? Yeah. So this is a chorus from the play Phaethon. So Phaethon, of course, is the son of Helios, who asks to use the chariot and doesn't drive it responsibly and crashes it, right? Like any child given the keys. Yeah. It's a little warning to those of us who have children who will be driving one day.
Just don't give them the keys to the sun.
Don't give them the keys to the sun or the Hyundai, whatever.
Either one.
But there's this really beautiful choral passage that's been preserved from, it's called the Dawn Chorus. And so one of my sort of favorite things in life is like when you get up early and you see like, you know, the people like opening up the coffee shop and the world is waking up. And so this chorus is kind of like the ancient Greek version of that, right? Like the shepherds are heading out to the, you know, to the pastures, etc. And it's this really beautiful moment before the tragedy comes. Right. And this is like one of the great skills of Euripides, I think, is sort of giving you that foreboding, right? You know, a tragedy is coming. You are watching a play by Euripides or you're reading a play by Euripides, but you've got this beautiful dawn chorus that happens beforehand. So that chorus was or music to go with it was composed by a fellow named Alex Silverman, right? Who is, as far as I'm concerned, a genius. He's very good with like ancient meter, with understanding how it operates, with transposing it into something that can communicate that to modern audiences. So he composed the music for it. And a group of students from the University of British Columbia actually went to Greece. So with Toph Marshall and Hallie Marshall. Actually, Hallie Marshall is the one who organizes this whole project, and recorded for Barefaced Greek. Right. Yes. And Helen Eastman also works with Barefaced Greek. And they recorded a short film. You can find it on YouTube under Barefaced Greek. It's the Dawn Chorus.
I feel like I have it open because Tom sent it to me a while ago, and I hadn't.
It's so good. It's so good.
So it's good. It's on Naxos, right?
Yes, they filmed it on Naxos.
Yeah. Okay.
So I have to admit I was on that trip with them, with those students, but I didn't go to Naxos because I had to come back to Canada for a conference, and I have kicked myself ever since.
Best island.
But you will notice the students who are performing the chorus in many of the scenes are wearing orange jewelry, which is all of my jewelry that I brought for them to borrow, which should speak to the absolute volume of jewelry I own. Anyways.
Well, your Instagram handle also helps with that.
Yes, that's true. Anyways, so they filmed this, and so I got to hear them rehearsing and singing it, and like singing it at various ancient sites, like singing it in the theater at Epidaurus.
Yeah.
And it's this like beautiful, youthful, chorus of university students, right? So the way it's performed and the way that it just brings this fragment back to life, gives it life. Fragments are hard to bring back to life. They're harder to bring back to life than whole plays. There's no question. And the combination of the way the music has been composed and the performers and the setting is just, to me, really magical. But it really also just has really embraced the essence of what is happening in the context of that play too. Yeah. So it's going to have a special place in my heart forever.
Well, I'm going to link it in the episode's description, that video.
Oh, please do. Please do. Yeah. It's really wonderful. And it just shows like the collaboration of Alex Silverman, of Helen Eastman, of Hallie, of these really talented, creative people who understand how to make the ancient world sing again.
Yeah. Just come back to life. Oh, I love that so much. Well, I mean, I feel like that's a perfect place to end it, and with something for the listeners to go watch after.
Exactly. And they'll all be singing the song. It's still stuck in my head.
Oh, I love that. Oh, God. Even just hearing notes played yesterday, or I don't even know if it was notes. There was a lot of musical technicality that I am not familiar with, but just like even hearing the sounds, I can see Michaela laughing. I can just hearing the sounds that are supposed to go along with it. Meanwhile, she was on the call, but not on the call, typing away to me about how her classical piano training was coming in handy.
That's the thing. I don't know enough about music to really
same
grasp it in the way that people who have like classical training are like, oh yes, that's that mode or whatever. And I'm like, it's a semitone. And I'm like, oh, okay. But that's to me is the beauty of the fellow Alex Silverman. He can take that kind of knowledge, but he uses it in a way that communicates what the ancient music was trying to do to us in the modern world using sort of a more modern vernacular. It's incredible. Yeah.
I'm excited for that. I just, and I want to find all the music I can for the series because it's just, it's so exciting.
Yes.
Well, this has been so much fun. Thank you for talking Euripides with me, / just letting me kind of fangirl about him.
Any day. It was the fangirls of Euripides meeting today.
Well, is there anything you want to share with my listeners about where to learn more, read more? I know I didn't even remember or mention it, but I will have in the introduction anyway, but you also spoke with me about Freeney and have that book available. But anything else you want to share?
Yeah, well, this project is not a book yet. It was my dissertation for my PhD way back in the day. As I mentioned, quite a while ago, my child is almost the exact same age as my dissertation and she is getting big. But it is something that I am going to put into book form in the next couple of years. It's, as you can tell, it's something that's too interesting to leave undone. Lots of people have been working on fragments more and more and more these days, which I'm really excited to see. And so if you want to read more, my suggestion to your readers is go get the Loeb edition. There's from I think 2008, a lovely version of Euripides Fragments. And it's edited by Collard and Crop. But it's a really good, accessible way to dig into the fragments. They do a pretty good job of putting together what's useful and helping, someone who's new to the fragments to kind of navigate them, which is always the challenge. Fragments, when you look at a page of fragments, they have all these little annotations and markings that can be a little bit overwhelming. So head to the lobe is what I would say, and read up. And it's Euripides, so it's going to be full of absolute gems.
Truly, he was just a weird guy in the most joyful way. Oh, nerds, thank you all so much for listening. As always, I'm so excited for this series. It's just been so much fun. And we, of course, have so much more still to go. On Tuesday, I'm going to be talking about Euripides and the gods in whatever forms I can share. I want to look at the way that Euripides handles gods as characters, ways that he might sort of push the boundaries, mix things up compared to the other tragedians. I mean, he did some weird stuff when it comes to the gods. I mean, including the fact that I'll never get over the way he wrote Apollo as like a piece of shit. I'm just fascinated. So that's coming Tuesday. And then, of course, just so much more. We're going to talk about Euripides for as long as possible, quite honestly. Let's Talk About Myths, Baby is written and produced by me, Liv Albert. Michaela Pengowish is the producer. This is the same Michaela, I will note. She has just changed her name to a matriarchal badassery name that is better for her, and also, it sounds amazing. The podcast is part of the iHeart Podcast Network. Listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or wherever you get your podcasts. I am Liv, and I love the person in the future who invents the time machine that doesn't disrupt the time-space continuum.